The night Scarlett Devin signed her name on that contract, her hand didn't shake. She had promised herself it wouldn't. She had cried enough in the parking garage before walking in, sitting in her car with the engine off and the January cold seeping through the windows, thinking about Lily. Her daughter's face when she woke up that morning, still expecting everything to be okay. So by the time the pen touched the paper, Scarlett was empty. And empty, she had learned, was easier to work with than afraid. The man across the table watched her sign without expression. Julian Mercer, 41 years old, founder of Mercer Capital, one of the wealthiest private equity managers in the country. The financial papers called him methodical. The people who'd worked for him called him something else. He sat with a kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm. It comes from having spent so long controlling every room you enter that stillness becomes a reflex. He slid the second copy of the agreement toward himself and read it once more, even though he'd drafted every clause himself. His lawyer, a careful man named Bernard, sat to his left and said nothing. Scarlett's own lawyer hadn't been able to come on such short notice. She hadn't told anyone she was here tonight. The arrangement was simple, at least on paper. Scarlett would move into Julian's home in Westmount for 6 months. She would attend events at his side as needed, present a convincing image of stability for his upcoming corporate merger, a deal that required his major investors, a quietly conservative family office based in Calgary, to believe Julian Mercer was a settled, serious man with roots. After 6 months, she would receive $250,000. Her daughter's medical bills would be cleared. The lease on their apartment would be paid for 2 years in advance, and Scarlett would walk away, no strings, no contact. She didn't look at him when she slid the signed copy back. He didn't thank her. Bernard gathered the papers into a leather folder, and that was that. The deal was done. Outside, it had started to snow. The house in Westmount was not what Scarlett expected, and she had tried to expect very little. It was enormous and pale gray with tall windows that looked out onto a garden that even in January had a kind of severe, manicured dignity. A woman named Greta met her at the door, the housekeeper, somewhere in her 60s, with close-cropped silver hair and the sort of warmth that seemed to exist specifically in contrast to the house itself. "Your room is on the second floor," Greta said, taking Scarlett's bag before she could protest. "Mr. Mercer is in a call until 8. He said to make yourself comfortable." Scarlett didn't ask what comfortable was supposed to mean in a house with 12 rooms and no photographs on the walls. She followed Greta upstairs, and when the door to her room closed, she sat on the edge of the bed, which was too large, too white, too quiet, and called her sister. Naomi picked up on the second ring. "How's Lily?" Scarlett asked first, before anything else, because that was always first. "She's fine," Naomi said. "She ate dinner. She's asking where you are. I told her you had a work trip." Scarlett looked at the ceiling. "Tell her I'll call tomorrow morning. Tell her I love her. Scar." Naomi's voice dropped. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Scarlett said honestly. She'd stopped lying to Naomi when they were teenagers. "But I'm doing it." She didn't hear from Julian that evening. She found the kitchen on her own, made tea she didn't really want, and sat at a window looking out at the city lights until she was tired enough to sleep. The first week was defined by silence and logistics. Julian left early and returned late. When they did share space, a morning in the kitchen, a brief overlap in the hallway. He was polite in the way that costs nothing, a nod, a brief word about the schedule, a reminder from Bernard about an event on Thursday that they would both need to attend. He treated her like a variable that had been accounted for, nothing more. Scarlett told herself this was fine. This was in fact ideal. She was not here to know him. Thursday came. It was a dinner at a restaurant in Old Montreal, a private room, 8 guests, 2 of Julian's senior partners, a representative from the Calgary family office named Gerald Thorne, and their wives and partners. Scarlett wore the dress Greta had quietly left on her bed that morning, dark blue, simple, and she understood without anyone saying so that someone had selected it deliberately. She sat beside Julian and played the part well, she thought. She asked questions when questions were appropriate. She laughed at the right moments. She mentioned, when it came up naturally, that she had grown up in Halifax, that she had a degree in occupational therapy, that she had always wanted to see more of Quebec in winter. All true things. She was not a good liar and so had decided early not to be one. Gerald Thorne was a silver-haired man in his late 60s who spoke slowly and listened carefully. At one point during dessert, he turned to Scarlett and said, "You seem like a grounding influence on Julian. I mean that as a genuine compliment." Scarlett smiled. "I don't know if that's what I am," she said, "but I'm trying." Julian, beside her, said nothing, but she felt him turn slightly, just a fraction, as if something had surprised him. On the drive home, the city sliding by outside the window, Julian said, "You did well tonight." "I wasn't performing," Scarlett said. She hadn't meant it to come out with an edge, but it had. "I just talked to people." There was a pause. "I know," Julian said. "That's why it worked." She looked at him then, just briefly, in the low light of the car. He was looking straight ahead. She turned back to the window. The second week brought a snowstorm and 3 canceled meetings, which meant Julian was home more than either of them had planned for. Scarlett learned quickly that he operated best when occupied. He moved through the house with purpose even on an idle afternoon, reading at his desk, taking calls from his office, occasionally appearing in the kitchen at odd hours for coffee. He was not a man who knew how to rest, and watching him try was unexpectedly human. She found him in the library on a Tuesday afternoon, a room she hadn't been sure she was allowed into, standing in front of a shelf with a book in his hand and a look on his face that was entirely different from any expression she'd seen him wear in public. He looked for a moment like someone much younger. Then he heard her and the expression closed. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't know you were in here." "It's your house too," he said. "For 6 months. You don't need to apologize." She came in anyway and looked at the shelves, which were well organized and extensive, and told her things about him she hadn't expected. Canadian history, architecture, a whole shelf of poetry with cracked spines, meaning they'd been read. She pulled one out without thinking. Al Purdy. She'd read him in undergrad. "You know him?" Julian asked. And there was genuine curiosity in it, unguarded, as if the question had escaped before he could make it formal. "He was assigned reading," she said. "But then I kept going. There's one poem about a hotel room in Sudbury that I still think about sometimes." Julian was quiet for a moment. He looked at the book in her hands with an expression she couldn't read. "My father gave me that one," he said. "He used to drive up to Sudbury for work. He said it described something he couldn't put into words himself." She looked at the book, then back at him. She handed it to him without saying anything. He didn't take it. "Keep it," he said, and left the room. That night, Greta appeared at Scarlett's door with a cup of tea she hadn't asked for. "Some nights are longer than others here," Greta said simply, and left again. Scarlett understood that this was as close as Greta ever got to saying something directly. The pattern began to shift after that. Gradually, the way snow accumulates. You don't notice it happening, and then suddenly there's an inch of it. Julian started having dinner at the table instead of his office. Not every night, but often enough that it became something Scarlett stopped bracing for and started expecting. They talked about small things first, out of necessity. The news, a documentary she'd been watching, a restaurant Greta had recommended in the neighborhood. Then one night he asked about Lily. Scarlett went still. She had not mentioned her daughter's name in this house. She was certain of it. "Your sister called the landline this afternoon," Julian said. "She was looking for you." Greta took the message. He paused. "She mentioned your daughter." Scarlett set down her fork carefully. "She is 7 years old," Scarlett said. "She had a kidney condition diagnosed 18 months ago. It is being managed. The bills are why I'm here." Julian said nothing for a long moment. The silence was not unkind. She waited for the follow-up question, the calculation, the judgment. Instead, he said, "I didn't know about the daughter. It wasn't in the information you gave Bernard." "No," Scarlett said, "it wasn't." "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because I was afraid you'd use her as leverage." The words sat between them. Julian's expression was complicated in a way she hadn't seen before, something that looked like it cost him something to feel. He picked up his glass and looked at it, not her. "That's a reasonable assumption to make about me," he said quietly. "I'm not sure it's wrong." She didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing. The next morning he asked Greta to set up the guest room with better Wi-Fi and a drawing table, and when Scarlett asked why, Greta said only, "Mr. Mercer thought your daughter might visit on weekends, if you wanted. That it might be easier." Scarlett stood in the doorway of the guest room for a long moment, looking at the low table with a ream of paper on it and a set of colored pencils in a wooden box. And she didn't cry, but it was close. She called Naomi that night. He set up a room for her, she said. Naomi was quiet. "Scar." "I know," Scarlett said. Lily came the following Saturday, brought up on the train by Naomi. and Scarlett met them at the station with her coat half-zipped and her heart doing something irregular in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Lily launched herself forward the way 7-year-olds do, all trust and forward motion, and Scarlett held her tight enough that Lily said, "Ow, Mom," and laughed. On the drive back to Westmount, Lily pressed her face against the window and asked if they were in a castle. Scarlett told her it was just a house. "But it's a very big one," Lily said, with the authority of someone who has never needed to be diplomatic about these things. Julian was home. Scarlett had not told Lily he would be there, and she had not told Julian precisely what time they were arriving. When they walked in, he was in the front hall, having just come back from somewhere, still in his coat. He looked at Lily with an expression that was careful, attentive, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand. Lily looked back at him with absolutely no reserve whatsoever. "Are you Julian?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Mom talks about you," Lily said. Scarlett made a small involuntary sound. "What does she say?" Julian asked, and for the first time since Scarlett had moved into this house, she heard something that might have been amusement in his voice. Lily considered this seriously. "She says you work a lot, and that you have a really good library." Julian looked at Scarlett then, briefly, with an expression she couldn't entirely decode, but that made her face warm. "That's accurate," he said to Lily. "Would you like to see it?" Lily said yes before Scarlett could say anything, and that was that. Greta served hot chocolate in the library, which was not normally a hot chocolate kind of room, but somehow Greta had understood that the room needed to become something different for the afternoon. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor with her cup and looked at the lower shelves, which Julian had left accessible with obvious intention. He sat in the armchair nearby and read, or appeared to read, while Lily pulled books out one at a time and examined them with great seriousness. That evening, after Naomi had taken Lily back to the station, Scarlett found Julian in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter with a glass of water, looking out the window at nothing in particular. He looked for the second time, like someone she didn't entirely recognize from the version of him she had first met. "She's extraordinary," he said without turning around. "I know," Scarlett said. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother died when I was 9, he said. "My father managed by not managing, if that makes sense. He went into the business and stayed there. I raised myself in a lot of ways, by which I mean I didn't." Scarlett leaned against the counter and waited. She had learned by now that Julian said things like this in small doses quickly, and then pulled back. "She didn't want to spook it. She's lucky," he said. "That's all. To have a mother who'd sign a contract like that for her." "It's not luck," Scarlett said. "It's just love." He looked at her then. "I know," he said. "I'm aware those aren't the same thing." The third month arrived with longer days, colder nights, and something in the house that Scarlett had no name for, but felt in the way Julian left the library door open when she was home, in the way Greta stopped looking at her, like a temporary arrangement, and started looking at her like something more permanent, in the way Julian had begun asking her opinion on things, a renovation for the spare office, a shortlist for a charitable foundation he was starting, whether she thought a certain event on his calendar was worth attending. She always gave honest answers. He seemed to have come to depend on that. One afternoon she found a folder on the kitchen counter with her name on it. Inside was a revised version of the medical payment plan for Lily's treatment, already submitted and confirmed. The payment had been made in full, ahead of schedule, with 2 additional follow-up appointments pre-booked. She went to find him. He was on a call in his office and she stood in the doorway until he noticed her, then held up the folder. He held up one finger, wait, and finished the call. "You weren't supposed to do that yet," she said when he hung up. "We have 3 months left." "I know," he said. "The contract says." "I've read the contract, Scarlett." "Then why?" He stood up and came around the desk, and the space between them was closer than she was used to, close enough that she could see clearly that he was choosing his words with unusual care. "Because I wanted to," he said. "And because I could. And because your daughter's treatment shouldn't be tied to my business deal." Scarlett looked at the folder in her hand. She had spent 2 years carrying that number, the amount, the debt, the weight of it, and it was gone now, just like that, because of a man she had met 2 months ago over a contract she had almost been too ashamed to sign. She didn't know what to do with any of that. She looked up at him. "You didn't have to do it like this." "No," he said. "But I wanted you to know it was done, not because of the agreement. Just because it should be." She nodded. Her throat was doing something she didn't want it to do. She said, "Thank you, Julian." Just his first name, which she hadn't used before, and she saw it register on his face. The complications began, as they always do, from an unexpected direction. Gerald Thorne came back into the picture. Not at a dinner this time, but at a smaller gathering at a colleague's home, a Sunday afternoon kind of event, with fewer people and more conversation. He found Scarlett near the bookshelf in the living room and asked her, pleasantly enough, how long she and Julian had been together. Scarlett gave the answer they'd rehearsed. Gerald nodded, then said, "You know, I had someone look into your background. Standard due diligence for this level of investment." Scarlett kept her face neutral. "Your daughter," he said. "Her medical condition, the bills, the timing of your moving in with Julian." He paused. "I'm not a foolish man, Miss Devin." The room felt very still. Scarlett said carefully, "I don't know what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting," Gerald said, "that Julian Mercer may have made a significant error of judgment, and that it's the kind of error that could affect the confidence of the people I represent." She held his gaze. "What Julian does with his personal life is his own," she said, "and the people who matter to him know who he is." Gerald studied her for a moment. "Do they?" he said, and then moved on. She told Julian that night. She had expected him to be calculating about it, to assess the damage, strategize, call Bernard. Instead, he sat on the opposite end of the couch and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "I'll handle Gerald." "That's not what I'm worried about," she said. "What are you worried about?" She looked at him honestly, which she'd learned was the only way to look at him. "That you'll decide it's not worth it," she said. "That the merger matters more." Julian was quiet for a long time. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than she'd ever heard it. Not measured, not controlled. "I have spent 15 years deciding things based on what they're worth," he said. "I have been, by any reasonable measure, successful at it." He looked at her. "I don't want to make that calculation right now." She understood what he was not quite saying. She didn't push it. Gerald Thorne's concerns did not disappear, but they became, over the following weeks, less decisive. Julian met with him privately twice. He did not tell Scarlett what was said, only that it had been handled, and that the merger would proceed. She didn't ask more than that. She was learning that Julian told her things when he was ready to tell them. What she didn't expect was Naomi calling her on a Tuesday morning, voice low and careful, saying, "Scar, there's something you need to know. About Julian's company. About 5 years ago." Scarlett sat down at the kitchen table. The early light was coming through the window. "Tell me," she said, the story Naomi had pieced together from a former colleague, who had worked briefly at Mercer Capital before it was Mercer Capital, when it was still a smaller firm, was this. Julian had acquired a chain of small physiotherapy clinics across Atlantic Canada. The deal had been efficient, the margins had improved, and 2 years later he had sold the clinics to a larger corporation. What happened next was that the new owners had restructured, and 8 of the clinics had closed, mostly in small communities without alternatives. Scarlett's father, who had worked as a physiotherapist in one of those clinics, had lost his job. He had never found comparable work afterward. He had died the following year, a heart attack, 63 years old, having spent his last year anxious and diminished and convinced he had failed his family. Scarlett sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after Naomi stopped talking. She didn't go looking for Julian right away. She spent 3 hours in her room, lying on top of the covers with her coat still on, working through the layers of it. The anger, the unfairness of the coincidence, the complicated grief she still carried for her father, and underneath all of it, the question of what Julian had known and what he had simply not cared about enough to find out. She found him in the early evening, in the kitchen, making coffee with the focused attention he gave to most small tasks. He looked up when she came in and read her face in the way he had, by now, become good at. "Something's wrong," he said. "Did you own a chain of physiotherapy clinics in Atlantic Canada?" she said. "About 6 years ago?" He was very still. "Yes," he said. 8 clinics closed after you sold." "Yes. My father worked in one of them. He died the year after." Julian put down the coffee cup. The room was quiet in a way that felt different from the usual quiet of the house. He looked at her, and for the first time she could not read his expression at all, only that it was serious and that it was real. "I didn't know that," he said. "I want you to know that's not an excuse. I didn't track what happened to individual employees after the sale. I should have, but I didn't. She looked at him. Did you know the closures were likely? He didn't look away. I knew restructuring was probable, he said. I didn't know the scale. I told myself that was someone else's decision to make. She nodded slowly. The anger was still there. But underneath it was something more complicated. The recognition that the man in front of her had just told her the truth, when he could have easily found a cleaner version of it, and that she was not sure, even now, whether she could hold against him the person he had been 6 years ago when she had spent the last 3 months watching him become someone different. I'm not asking you to forgive that, Julian said quietly. I'm not sure I'd know how to ask for that. I'm not ready to, Scarlett said. I just needed you to know that I know. He nodded. He didn't try to fill the silence. She left the kitchen and went back upstairs, and she sat with it for a long time, the entire weight of it. Her father, this house, this man, this strange accidental life she was living inside someone else's. Outside, the city was lit up and enormous and entirely unconcerned. She did not leave. She wasn't sure she could explain why, except that leaving felt like choosing a clean story over a true one, and she had never been good at choosing the clean version. In the weeks that followed, things between them were different. Not cold. Something more honest than before, if that was possible, because there was no pretending now that this was simple or that they were strangers. Julian gave her space and she used it, and then she stopped needing quite as much of it. They talked about her father once, briefly, and it was not comfortable, but it was real, and after that it stayed in the room between them, in a way that was less like a wound and more like a scar, permanent, but healed over, carrying a different weight. Lily visited again at the end of March, and Julian had cleared his Saturday deliberately, though he didn't announce it. He was just there, available in the way that reads differently than it used to, present, rather than merely not absent. He and Lily sat at the low table in the guest room, and built an extremely ambitious structure out of wooden blocks that Greta had produced from somewhere. And Lily narrated the entire process with the focused authority of a small architect. Julian listened with the same attention he brought to everything, and Scarlett, standing in the doorway, thought that this was the truest thing she had seen in a long time. At one point, Lily stopped building and looked up at Julian very seriously. She said, "Are you in love with my mom?" Greta, in the hallway behind Scarlett, made a small sound. Julian didn't look at Lily the way most adults look at children when they ask inconvenient questions, slightly amused, slightly deflecting. He considered it. "I think I am," he said honestly. "Yes." Lily nodded. She said, "She's not very good at letting people be nice to her. You have to be patient." And then she went back to her blocks. Julian looked up over Lily's head and found Scarlett in the doorway. She didn't move. "I know," he said, still looking at Scarlett. "I'm working on the patience." May arrived, and with it the last month of the contract. The event on her calendar, 6 months, end date, the moment everything was supposed to dissolve back into the clean lines of an agreement, came closer each day, and Scarlett thought about it less than she'd expected, not because she was avoiding it, but because the house had become too real to think about leaving in abstract terms. Greta's morning tea, the library with its crack-spine poets, the sound of Julian on an early call down the hall, and the particular way the house felt when he was in it versus when he was not. One evening near the end of May, Julian came to find her on the back porch, which was a cold and probably inadvisable place to sit at 9 in the evening in Montreal. But Scarlett had grown up in Halifax and the cold didn't bother her, and she liked how the city looked from here, all lit-up ambiguity. Julian had 2 mugs. He handed her one without asking, which she'd noticed he'd stopped asking about weeks ago. "The contract ends in 17 days, he said. "I know. I've asked Bernard to draw up a different one." He paused. "Or not a contract at all, actually. I asked him to draw up something else." She looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend I've handled everything correctly," Julian said. "With the clinics, with any of it. I've spent a lot of years being very good at acquiring things and very bad at understanding the cost." He held his mug and looked out at the same city she was looking at. "You've shown me something about that. You and Lily both." Scarlett waited. "I don't want you to leave in 17 days, he said. "I want you to stay, not because of the merger, not because of Gerald Thorne or the investors or any of it." He turned and looked at her directly, which was something Julian Mercer did when he wanted to make sure there was no misunderstanding. "Because this is the most honest I've been in a building I own in 15 years. And I don't want to lose that." She looked at him for a long time. The city hummed. Somewhere below them, a door opened and closed. She thought about her father, and the clinics, and the contract she'd signed in January with a steady hand. She thought about Lily saying, "You have to be patient," with the absolute confidence of someone who has not yet learned that the world doesn't always reward patience. "I'm not the same woman who walked in here in January," she said finally. "I know," Julian said. "Neither am I." She looked at her mug. Then she said, "I want Lily to have her own room. A real one, not a guest room." Julian was quiet for 1 second, then, "Done, and I'm going back to work. My own work." "You don't get a say in that. I wouldn't presume to." She looked at him. "And we take this slowly," she said. "Whatever this is, I'm not signing anything." Julian almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile she had learned to recognize over 5 months, the one that lived just at the edges of his usual composure, and meant that something real was happening behind it. "No contracts," he said. "I think we've had enough of those." She nodded, and then she stayed where she was, on the cold back porch with the city spread out in front of them, their shoulders almost touching, and it was quiet, and it was enough. 3 weeks later, Lily moved in on a Saturday morning with an overnight bag, a stuffed rabbit named Captain, and the immediate and authoritative opinion that her room needed more yellow. Julian told her she could pick the paint. Lily said she'd think about it, which Scarlett recognized as her daughter's way of taking something seriously. Greta brought hot chocolate without being asked. The sun came through the tall windows of the front hall and lit the whole place up differently than Scarlett remembered from January, when it had been cold and gray, and full of the particular silence of a house where no one has been happy in a long time. Now it sounded like Lily explaining to Julian the structural deficiencies of his block-building technique. It sounded like Greta laughing at something in the kitchen. It sounded like a house deciding, slowly and without ceremony, to become a home. Scarlett stood in the hallway and listened. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.